Yeah.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
You want me to go tell them?
I just
Yeah,
did.
go put the lights on.
Dennis and Sharon and Jonathan, can you all hear and see the slides? Hear me and see the slides?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, excellent. So far, technology is blessing us this morning instead of being a curse.
We got the blessing part.
Yeah. So we're doing the second chapter in this new book that Dennis started for us last week, called Prophetic People Embrace Peace and Justice. Chapter 2 is written by Carolyn Brock and is titled Accepting God's Healing Grace. I probably have only formally met Carolyn one time in my life, and I think she was the World Church spiritual formation specialist for a long time.
I looked her up and she's still on the team, but Katie
Still on the spiritual formation team, but Katie McLaughlin, Harmon McLaughlin
is the team
is
member.
the leader of that, I think now. So,
Yeah.
as you might expect, my feeling was that her points of view take a very compatible alignment with what you would expect somebody who is a very spiritual person to think and write. So we're going to kind of go through. I'm actually going to just spend more time today talking about some of the statements that she makes and letting us talk about it as a group to make sure that we understand, I think, the points that she's trying to get to. First time I read through the lesson, I had some questions and I thought, oh, I don't know if I can really relate to everything she's saying. And then the more I read it, the more I thought about it, the more it maybe started to take hold with me a little bit. So I'll do my best. So let's start by beginning this morning. Ultimately, we want to bring the discussion around to peace and justice, but we have a ways to go to get there today. And understanding peace and justice from the perspective of healing and grace may or may not make sense to you right out of the gate. It took me a little while to get a grasp on it, as I said, but I think I'm understanding it. So let's begin with the question that she asks. Have you had a time in your life when you needed healing, but you had a difficult time accepting God's grace? Go ahead and feel free to share just in a sentence or two. If you feel
Most of my life, I always felt when she talked about shame, it brought back the memories of shame and how I felt.
Yeah.
And I had a difficulty with the God of grace and the God of punishment. And I was always felt more the God of punishment than the God of grace.
Yeah. So that's exactly the segue that we need to get into this discussion. It's almost like I planted you there without thinking about it. That's exactly right. We're going to be talking a lot about shame today and punishment, and how does that get us to a point of acknowledging God as a God of grace and love and mercy and all of the other things that seem so diametrically opposed sometimes to the way that we traditionally have believed, I guess. Anybody else want to say a word or two here?
It took me a long time also to learn that it's easier to forgive others sometimes than to forgive yourself.
Oh, definitely.
So I had to learn that lesson over and over again. I call that.
Yeah, easier to forgive others than to forgive yourself. And sometimes, you carry things with you through your whole life, regrets that are hard to let go of. And you think of a moment that you really did something you wish you hadn't done or said to somebody, and the opportunity even maybe to make that right is past or seems to be past. I remember, what was the TV show about the guy that was trying to go make up all of the bad things he'd done to people?
Earl.
And so he was actually seeking people out that he hadn't seen in years to make good on the things that he felt bad about.
I would think people that suffer from survivor complex would have a real problem there.
Yeah, so I thought a lot about that plane crash in India, and the one guy who literally walked away from it, and everybody else didn't. What his life is going to be like, and if he's going to experience.
And down there in Texas with the Girl Scout, the girls camp, the people that survived that, the adults and the leaders, they're going to have a really rough time.
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult, sure. And it's hard to find God's grace in those moments. Sometimes we struggle to perceive a loving God when that happens. So I know we've talked about this before, so we won't spend a lot of time, but just in a word or two, what does grace mean to you? Give me a synonym of grace in your life.
I always think of it as God's gift.
Okay, a gift,
Faith,
Forgiveness,
forgiveness,
ultimate forgiveness.
faith
space.
to learn.
Okay, space to learn. Ultimate forgiveness,
Peace.
peace. Oh, okay.
I did not get peace.
What?
I did not get peace until I found grace.
Oh,
Any others? I would say love. I mean, that's what I
Yeah.
was brought up traditionally to believe. That
I was
grace and
gonna say-
love were intertwined.
Also acceptance.
Okay. Acceptance of or who?
Yeah.
Can you
I mean,
elaborate
like-
a little bit?
Acceptance that we aren't perfect,
Okay.
that we have
Acceptance
the
that we're not
grace to
perfect.
learn, to experience without, you know, being damned to hell or anything. You know, it's kind of that you have the grace to learn, but you also have the acceptance that you're not perfect, so
Yeah.
you're going to make bad.
So April
The
is
serenity
my
prayer.
other plant this morning.
I was gonna say the
You
serenity
come right down the
prayer,
road.
too.
You guys we were all on the same email. That's
It would also be a lack of judgment on somebody
lack of
else's part
judgment. Yeah.
towards
Okay.
you.
The author says, and I've heard this tied to grace many, many times in my life, that we have done nothing to deserve our existence. Well, we would say we have done nothing to deserve God's grace, but that's given to us in spite of, some of the mistakes that we make as we go down life's journey. Life is the gift of a gracious God. And when I read that, it made me think of a statistic, and I had to go back and look it up again. The odds of any one of us in this room being born, of your parents meeting, and all of the other biological things that have to take place in order for a child to be formed, is about 1 in 400 trillion. So how unique are each one of you? You are exquisitely unique. 1 in 400. You're not just 1 in a million. You're 1 in 400 trillion. So, and I've heard that quoted before. I just couldn't remember exactly what the number was, but I knew it was a lot. So she talks about images and metaphors or names for God. And over the years, again, I've done these types of exercises in different classes and things. What names or metaphors for God are meaningful to you? And just say, in one word, what a name for God that you use when you pray, maybe when you talk to God, what do you?
Creator.
Creator, okay.
Heavenly Father.
Jehovah, okay.
Heavenly Father.
Heavenly Father, okay. Anybody online, if you want to speak up and share, please do.
I just say Father.
Father, okay.
mystery.
What was it?
Mystery.
Okay. Her two fathers, and that's how Jesus taught us to pray. So I think that's ingrained in us. Father who art in heaven. Brock says that our experiences of the world lead us to know God, and I thought her terms were very interesting here as fire, light, intelligence, first life, first breath, source of all spirit. I can't say any of those would be ones that I commonly use to address God, but I think they're all relevant.
I would add presence, holy presence.
Holy presence, okay.
I like the way Kanitha does it. Hi, God.
Hi, God. Like a friend.
And then Tillich uses ground of being.
Grounded being, okay.
Ground up being.
Ground of being. All of the talk about fire and light and everything in this chapter made me think of, my early experiences with what I would say was the Holy Spirit, and it's, campfire. For a lot of us, maybe that's the truth. You know, that's the first time I ever recognized feeling something inside that was special. I wish Ron was here. I'm sure he would
Yeah.
probably.
Sometimes the instances when you have an awe experience with nature
Mhm.
just makes you feel like
Yeah.
you're with God.
Yeah. And it's, if you ever sit and, you know, when I've done backpacking and things at the end of a long day, you make a campfire and you just kind of sit quietly and you look into the fire and it has both dimension and depth and yet it changes constantly. It's a good way to meditate, to bring yourself close to God, I guess. And I think that nature is certainly part of that. All right, she talks about salvation. So first question, why are healing and grace central to the process of peacemaking? We're using this book to help us have a deeper understanding of what it means to be a peacemaker. And so according to Brock, God's agenda is the mending of creation. Where have we heard that before?
Tikkun olam.
I didn't understand you, Dennis.
The Jewish phrase tikkun olam.
Oh, okay, yeah. So we just finished a book written by a rabbi about Jewish beliefs, and that is something that is central to their understanding of their relationship with God. And we've talked about that. God is in the process of fixing the world, and it is the responsibility of each person to participate in that. Then we talked about shalom, and we talked about shalom as something that is more than just the absence of conflict between peoples, but something that's characterized by harmony and wholeness, rooted in justice, peace, and well-being for all creatures and for the earth itself. And so my question is this possible? Is this a rational wish, hope, dream, goal, objective? Any of those things?
I don't know if it's rational. Yeah.
I think it's possible, but it's not possible in our current society.
It seems impossible in current under
Yeah.
circumstances. Yeah.
That first sentence makes me think of you need to take care of yourself before you can take care of others.
Okay.
You've
This
got
is
to
to
love
heal
yourself before you can love others.
Or as they say in yoga, you have to fill your cup before you can fill someone else.
With somebody else's cup. Yeah.
But if you don't think it's possible, does that mean doesn't that make it not possible if you don't give it a possibility?
For me personally, if I didn't believe it was possible, I wouldn't have hope.
It doesn't feel possible,
It
but I
doesn't
feel
feel possible,
like
yeah.
it is possible in some form.
And like April said, I feel sometimes like I'm being rationally irrational to wish for something like this. But you know, we're not trying very hard right now as humanity. I think we can do better. We could do a whole lot better.
Well, we can do individual acts of peacemaking,
Yeah.
but we just can't expect the whole world to fall in line with our
And I think
thoughts.
sometimes don't you feel like we're called to do that in spite of what other people might be doing or not doing?
Yes.
You know, kind of the old starfish on the beach story that we're told.
Yeah, but my question is, if this is not the kind of life we want, why do we call this rational? Isn't this irrational to live a life that you don't think is the best?
Well, wouldn't it be rational to try to change that individually, I think, as Arlene is saying, even if we can't change it corporately yet? In other words, each one of us do what we can in our, to borrow some old terminology, our part of the vineyard.
A lot of it too is laziness, because we have the desire, but we just don't get out there and do it.
Well, and sometimes we don't know how to do it or what. I mean, you know, if I were to do it, it's like, it's such a big thing. And so sometimes the most I can do is maybe hold the door open or smile at somebody or,
It's easy to feel powerless.
yeah.
I mean, we might not be happy with the way things are, and so Nadine and I have participated in marches that we felt were important and said something. Did anything change? Probably not overall, but we felt better about what we'd done. Maybe we just need more people on board and try harder.
There was a sign
So,
on.
go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
saw a sign that said the best way to predict the future is to create it.
Yeah,
Ooh.
I like that.
Well, what's the in wholeness? Well-being for all creatures of the earth. I think that's a great ideal to have. The closer you have to enforcing that 100%, you do start to get a totalitarian hazard. You get utopian societies that become hell on earth. But I don't think we want to abandon some of those ideals. I don't know that human beings apart from God can create that vision. So that's why we need to have faith.
Well, I think that's why we're talking about this in the context of sort of the Jewish tradition that we're not doing this apart from God. We're doing this in concert with God as sort of partners in the effort.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say that my vision is that as we each show kindness and compassion, that maybe somehow a chain reaction that person then passes it on, and then
Yeah, you always hope, for the idea of passing it on. It started out, somebody bought a cup of coffee for the car behind them. And, you kind of pass that forward, what do they call it? Pass it forward.
pay it forward.
Yeah, and you hope that, your behaviors will somehow influence somebody else and, that there'll be this multiplication of effort over a space of time. So she talks about the concept of shalom. And again, this is not new to us. We've been talking about it for a number of weeks now. But from the Old Testament perspective of salvation being the healing of civilization, and just to quickly review, how is that the same or different from some of the Christian concepts that we have about salvation?
Well, it's different in that traditionally salvation has been viewed as after we die, our personal salvation.
And then there's a context too of God's, okay, the world is corrupt, so God's going to take us out of the world, and that's where we get concepts like the rapture. God, if you were a kid and went to a big department store with your mother and you got lost, you got separated from your mother, you realized you were all alone and you panicked and you went and found a store clerk or something and they got the microphone and said, "There's a little boy named Paul Bennetts here. Would his mother please come and pick him up? He's very distressed." And we have that rooted in us as the essence of salvation from a Christian concept, that God's going to come back, that Jesus is going to come back and rescue us and take us somewhere else. So the concept that Carolyn is talking about is, we're here, we're going to make this place better, or our parent is going to come and rescue us and take us home. Very different concepts. I'm not sure that I, can favor one or the other. I like the idea, since I'm alive now in this moment, that rebuilding the earth seems like maybe a positive thing to do. And then what happens after that, when I'm no longer part of this? Well, let God take care of that, I guess.
So where's the world's loudspeaker to call God to say, hey, we might need some help down here.
Yeah, well, I think that's called prayer. Dear God of mystery, help.
That's the guy standing on the street corner.
Yeah. Yeah. So she talks about Jesus coming to proclaim God's dream of a healed creation. Do you think this is God's dream? Well, let me tell you why I'm asking this question first. So that's what I would call an anthropomorphism. We've heard that word before, and we're talking about assigning human qualities to God. And so I had to pause and think about this. Does God dream? Is God dreaming of a healed creation? God is omnipresent, omnipotent, all-powerful. God could create a healed creation if God wanted to. And yet God doesn't. God, for some reason, wants us to work it out.
Free will.
So is it God's dream or is it our dream? Do we dream of a healed creation that would be the kind of world that we want our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to grow up in and exist in? So what do you think? Is that our response to God's Spirit beckoning us? And so we have that dream, or do you think God really dreams? I'm not convinced. I guess I'm saying that God dreams. I think God knows what's going on. Hopefully.
I don't know that he dreams, but he hopes that, he envisions a world that we're all peaceful. And, it's us being asleep at the wheel kind of thing, that we're not able to change some of the things that
Yeah,
are
see, and I'd go
completely in our power to change, but
Yeah.
we just don't.
I guess from my perspective, I would take that even a step farther. Dream, hope, those are all anthropomorphisms. I think God knows what we're capable of.
Yeah.
We just don't know what we're capable of doing. How hard are we going to work to be what God created us to be? And part of the whole shalom thing is, can we enable each other to be what God wants them to be and knows that they can be?
The problem is we get distracted by those shiny little objects over here.
The little bubbles.
We
All
do
right.
have people that really embody the power of one and make that difference, but then a lot of us just don't get to that level.
So I put the meme up here: dream big, work hard. A lot of us dream big, but the people that we see in civilization who actually accomplish great things usually accomplish those great things through a lot of hard work. You think about elite athletes or people who build businesses and then share that with the workers. There are good people who own businesses and then encourage the people that work for them to come along and be a part of that. We have a yard care service there all over Johnson County, but the workers are the owners of the business. They, after 2 years, they can actually own a part of the business, and so they feel very invested in what they're doing. And I've never had a bad, we've had lots of them working over at our house on our yard and landscape and things. I've never had somebody who didn't seem like they cared about their job because they felt an ownership in what was going on. And I even said that to the last guy that was over. I said, I really appreciate that your company allows ownership by the employees. And he said, that's why we work there. That's why we're there. So somebody dreamed big, they had the dream, but the dream isn't the fruition. The dream is not what's making it happen. It's the hard work that that J.C. Penney put into his company, right, Eloise? And then he made other, helped other people to see that vision.
And Martin Luther King
And Martin
put in
Luther
his
King
movement.
and lots of great people who have done wonderful things. All right. So Jesus, the name Jesus, at least in the Hebrew, is the one who makes salvus. So what is salvus? It's interesting that she brought this up because salvus is actually a Latin word. It's not a Hebrew word. Jesus's Hebrew name was Yeshua, which means literally God saves, or the one who makes salvus. And so salvus in Latin means safe, healthy, or unharmed. It's very consistent with the Jewish traditional beliefs about salvation. Okay, it's a place of safety. And you read all through the Old Testament, the Psalms and the prophets and everybody else, when they're talking about God save me, they're not saying God take me to another universe. They're saying God save me in this moment on this earth in my life. And that's precisely what it means. But it's also, interestingly enough, salvus, the name, which is what Jesus' name means, is Latin for words like salve. So what's a salve? It's a ointment that we put on for healing.
Yeah.
So it has healing qualities. And it also is the root word for salvage. So if a ship sinks, now this ship looks like it's caught in the ice. So when the ice melts, it's going to sink. But if there's $1 million in gold doubloons, something that's of great value, somebody's going to go down there in a diver suit and find those gold doubloons and salvage that, right? Because it's of great worth. And so if we see that God saving us in this life is a lot like salvaging a shipwreck. I mean, how many times have we said, "Oh, my life's a shipwreck"? Please, save me from this. So it's God actually reaching out to us and ministering to us to take that which is valuable in us and make something out of it.
And
So-
Jesus told parables about the kingdom and about like the lost coin
Mhm.
that, or the lost sheep, or the, so much worth, that it's not always apparent,
Yeah.
but
And so that's precisely where we're headed. Okay,
Mhm.
another plant in the oven. You guys are on the ball today.
You're next.
Tell you that side of the room.
You guys, this side here, well, we're going around the table. We're going around the table. But yeah, that's exactly right. It's recognizing our worth, our capacity, our gifts, and thanking, being grateful for that, expressing gratitude for what God has done. So I kind of shared with you now what Yeshua means and saving. What do you think about that? Does that square with your beliefs? Are you comfortable with it, or would you rather have Mom come and rescue you at the counter in the JCPenney store?
Little of both.
Little of both, okay.
I want the rescue there just in case, but
can you phrase that differently? What are the two approaches and how do they differ?
So one approach is for this world, it's for this place, and it's to make this broken world the place that God has envisioned. So what we in the Latter-day Saint tradition would probably call Zion. Okay, are we still building Zion, or did we give that up in the 1960s? That language has been lost and not used very much. I did hear something about it at conference. I think it's still out there somewhere. Or are we thinking of salvation in terms of this place is so horrible, get me out of here? Does that make sense? Those are the two frameworks. Beam me up, Scotty. Thank you. See, it is going around the table.
Come on in, I'm good.
Does that make sense? Did I answer your question, Ryan? And I'm just saying these are two perspectives. I'm not saying that anybody in this room or anybody listening on Zoom is obligated to believe one way or another, but these are the traditions that have brought us to this moment. And now we've got to decide, do I like one more than the other, or do I like some combination of the two, which I've heard this morning. April says, I like the idea that there's still a rescue available in case I mess it up.
Well,
but it's food for thought.
Yeah. I do think that we do need to think beyond this earth, and we don't have a lot of information about like the details of the afterlife and transcendent matters, but I don't think we should limit ourselves just to the here and now. But Jesus did say the kingdom of God is at hand. So it's kind of a both and. It's, we get a foretaste of heaven here on earth. And we look towards what's beyond, what's after death.
Yep. No, I think you are correct. I agree with that. I think at this point I'm trying to get us maybe to acknowledge that salvation is more than just what happens beyond the grave.
Yeah.
that we can live a life that says I'm saved now. To coin a term that the evangelicals use, I've been saved. So I'm
Well,
saved,
that's what-
but in a very different sense maybe than what
I
they
think
use.
that's what God wants of us. And we have to make the choices to do or not to do. And, so it's a kind of a circular motion
Yeah.
that we deal with.
Well, there's a lot in the scriptures too that tie, I mean, even in latter-day scripture, that tie the events that happen on the earth in reality and in real-time setting to the spiritual universe. We've talked about that as a movement since Joseph Smith, that there's a real world and a spiritual world, and the two, whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven, kind of a thing.
I was going to say, so shouldn't the kingdom of heaven first be in our hearts before it can become a physical?
Well, let's keep talking.
Second time she's appointed?
It's a little, the terminology is a little different, but I think what we're going to come to is if we get to it today, we'll answer your question. So how about healing and grace? Do we think of those two words in concert with each other? Are they two sides of the same coin, or are they something different? Well, we know that healing was central to the ministry of Jesus. There's lots of examples of that in the New Testament, and this is just one of them from Matthew 4:23. And Jesus often connected the coming of God's kingdom with healing. So that verse says, Jesus went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So the proclamation of God's kingdom is in the very same sentence as the acts of healing. Go back to the question, are healing and grace two sides of the same coin?
For me, it is, because I did not find grace until I found healing.
Okay. And a lot of times, if you look at these stories of healing in the New Testament, that's exactly what happens. The person experiences the grace, usually in the form of Jesus pronouncing God's forgiveness. Not that Jesus was giving the forgiveness. I mean, he was criticized by the Pharisees about that. We talked about that maybe last week. But rather that he was pronouncing the forgiveness of God, that God has already made the avenue possible for you to be forgiven. And in that moment, there's an experience of grace, and out of that comes a healing. I like that idea. Okay, Matthew 15:29 and 30. After Jesus had left that place, he passed along the Sea of Galilee. He went up to the mountain where he sat down, and great crowds came to him, bringing with him their lame and blind and maimed and mute and many others. And they put him at his feet, and he cured them. So we know that Jesus had been preaching, and of course we make the assumption here that the preaching was about the kingdom of God. He wasn't saying, okay, I'm going up on the mountain, bring all the sick people to me, and we're going to have a healing. He was talking about the coming of God's kingdom, and through that, people experienced something that said, we need to bring our sick to him and let him heal them, and he did. So again, I think there's kind of a connection there. Then Mark, he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crush him, for he cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. So his fame or notoriety, I guess, for being a healer as well as a preacher of the kingdom was so great that he was almost overwhelmed at times with the crowds. So this was a big part of who Jesus was. So what do the stories about the acts of Jesus healing people convey to you about God's grace, and more so about Jesus as the incarnation or the embodiment of God's love? So my sense is that Carolyn Brock is trying to get us to think maybe less about Jesus as the incarnation of God, and rather Jesus as the incarnation of God's love. And if we look at 1 John 4:7-10, this makes perfect sense to me, because John, in his testimony, or whoever wrote the book of 1 John, said, "Beloved, let us love one another, For love is from God, and whoever knows love has been born of God and knows God. And anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. And in this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world that we might live through him. And so here is nicely tied up in a bow, the message of God is love, and Jesus comes as the messenger incarnate of that love. What do you think about that?
Think of the healing presence of Jesus among people that they called that they thought the people had demons, you know, and we've talked about it a lot, that what was that, you know?
Mhm.
And I think part of it was people who were mentally ill, people who were spiritually ill, just ill with themselves. And so that then makes me believe that he came with this peaceful presence and was able to calm their souls. And that's what I think.
So I think about the emerging woman, the poor thing who was all alone. She said everything she had, she's unclean. And she, you know, should not be out in society. And she is so desperate that I think she sees this as her last hope, and she is doing something that she should not be doing. But she reaches out to touch the ZZ, or whatever they call it, the fringe. And in that moment, she's healed. And Jesus knows someone has touched her. And instead of, he could have condemned her because she was not pure. And instead, he calls her daughter and says that, you know, because of your faith, you've been healed. So she becomes family.
I've heard it said a number of times by mental health professionals that a lot of mental imbalance or lack of mental wellness, I guess, is a result of anger and shame being turned inward on ourselves. You know, it's whoever talked about forgiving ourselves first, or accepting grace ourselves first before we can, you know, be grace for somebody else's. You know, there's a great deal of power in that statement. I think, you know, Jesus healing demons or whatever, people with demons, seems a little far-fetched, just in the story itself. But at the root of the story, if what we're talking about there is a lack of mental wellness, it begins to make sense to me.
Well, I always felt that I had demons, especially in the middle of the night when they would come and harass me and terrorize me with, you know, thoughts that, you know, I am worthless. I am not worth saving. I am going to hell in a handbasket. And they definitely felt like demons.
Yeah, those feelings can be powerfully repressing and oppressing.
They were.
My father used to tell me there was a monster under my bed and he was going to get me if I got out of bed.
Oh my God. I could have some scars.
All right, so I've heard it mentioned this morning already. You know, the world is pretty rough right now. Has been for always. You know, how can things have gone so wrong? Are we separated from the grace of God? Are we in this shipwreck? And Carolyn says human freedom leaves the door open for us to embrace many possible identities and for cultures to create many systems of meaning and value. Living in the not yet expectation, okay, the not yet meaning salvation is somewhere beyond us right now. It's not for the time being. Standing on tiptoe, you know, you think about a child trying to look over a fence at a parade and see something, what's going on. Waiting for redemption, the creature still groans for the liberating truths of the gospel, and that terminology is found both in the New Testament as well as in the Doctrine and Covenants. So what's she talking about here? What's the meaning?
I think she's talking about those lament psalms that we groan for redemption every day.
What about as far as the causal factor there? He's talking about many cultures creating systems of meaning and value. Think about agency. I think she's talking about agency here. We have choices, we make choices, and people make a lot of bad choices sometimes. It can become very painful. It can create a lot of pain for a lot of people. I think that's what her meaning is. Is the author being critical of humanity and waiting for God to act? Should we be taking more of this responsibility on our own? And do you feel, is there something left to salvage? Is there something of great worth at the bottom of the ocean, but we got to dive down there and see if we can find it and bring it back?
Kind of on a personal, I can see if you're doing something for selfishness, it might go out and affect people in negative ways. If you think more about the good you can do for others, then things kind of balance out in a more positive expectation. I had an event at my work where I think some of that was happening, and some people were affected negatively and others got what they wanted. It was kind of like a self, you know what I'm saying? I'm just kind of thinking of that experience, and the building could have been in a more positive place, but then there were kind of people kind of backed off and said, I'm not gonna bother, those people. And it created a negative environment. Does that make sense? I think that's kind of an example of what kind of more on a global, think about it in a global way.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I think she's saying, we have a culture, a way of living, and a way of thinking that has gotten us into trouble. But, what do we do about that? Well, we start by recognizing that all are worthy. We're going to be coming to the communion table this morning. And I think the beginning of peacemaking happens when we recognize that every person in that sanctuary has a right to be there and a need to be there and is welcomed by the grace of God to participate in that sacrament. And there are no defeat the concept of grace. Is unmerited love and mercy, and we are of what we've been. Okay, there are no measures by which we can prove ourselves worthy or unworthy, accepted or not accepted. God accepts all of us. That's the fundamental place that we're starting from as peacemakers and justice makers, is that right there. Everybody's worthy.
I think this new song that we have in the hymnal of "For Everyone Born, a Place at the Table"
Yep.
is so
I
powerful.
love that. It's a great hymn.
I have a hard time with the word acceptance because I don't know what it means when people use it. That is to say, there's different ways of defining it, and it can change at any one time. I struggle with this learning about music therapy and the therapy, modern therapy. There's a lot of affirmation, which I think is good up until a point, and then it metastasizes into anything you do is great and I accept you. It's like, no, there is such thing as right and wrong. If you beat your wife, I'm not going to accept that is that's not moral.
Yeah.
But am I going to still treat you as a patient and respect? Well, that is another question. One of my advisors last year he had worked with sexual criminals, and just imagine just any number of bad things we can do. So what does acceptance mean?
Well, so I think we're going to see as if we get through many more of these slides, we're kind of running out of time here. Maybe next week before we get back to it. But are we talking about behaviors that we're accepting of, or are we talking about accepting the person fundamentally as a human being of worth and potential?
Mhm.
So, you say, well, what's acceptable to you? Well, it's not acceptable to me that people break the law or hurt other people or commit violence or abuse other people. But at its very base, at its very core, I think what she's calling on us to think about is that that person was 1 out of 400 trillion at some point in their life,
Mhm.
and what's happened to them. Okay, we're not responsible for the experiences that they had, but they've had life's experiences that have led them to the choices that they make. Okay, we may not agree with those choices, but do we still find that person as potentially salvageable? Can we go down and dive down and find the worth in them and bring it back up to the surface?
Mhm.
And I think that's would be my answer to your I understand your question. And I hear that all the time. We say, well, I can't donate $10 to that person on the street because they could go out and get a job. That's not acceptable to me. We're evaluating their behaviors as opposed to evaluating their worth as a human being. And I think we're just saying, or Carolyn is saying, we all have fundamental worth apart from who we may have become that might not make everybody happy. But I get your point. I really do.
Well, and if we don't look at them as having worth, then we're potentially saying they can't be redeemed and they cannot change and have grace.
And that's what we're saying we want in the world. We want people to change. We want this to be the kingdom that Jesus proclaimed it would be. And if somehow we can't first accept others at whatever level they're coming in at, then we don't have any hope. We really don't.
You don't have to accept their behavior, but if there's any chance of them being redeemed, you have to recognize they have at some level worth. They are still created by God. They are still loved by God. It doesn't mean, it's sort of like forgiveness. If you don't forgive, you're holding in all these toxic emotions. It doesn't mean that what they did, if you forgive them, it doesn't mean that what they did is okay. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be held responsible. But I don't know. I don't know if I'm making sense.
I don't, to me, this is the reason that people go and do prison ministry. I mean, what's more awful than, being sentenced to life imprisonment for some horrible deed that you've done? And I know Carolyn and David Brock did that. They were prison ministers for a while.
Oh,
Says it in the book. And so, they're doing exactly that. They're going to in and trying to find out where's the value in this human being, and can we recover some of that by.
My father and sometimes we as a family would go over to Lansing, mostly the women's prison, although I think he went to the men's prison.
Yeah.
And it was a program. Can't remember the name of the program now, but it was.
So the minister at the men's penitentiary where the in cold blood criminals.
James Post.
Yeah, Jim Post was a church member.
Yeah, he was.
He was the chaplain there.
I know in my own experience, I used to have they call it the jail pastor. They call the ministers or the high priest of my church come over and minister.
Yeah.
That was.
I do want to talk about the young man Kimball that was here for a while. Yeah, that's what he wants to do. He talked a lot about prison ministry. And the part of it was because growing up gay in the Mormon church had to be torture.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in any type of Christian household when we were young. And so he had to learn his own work before he could go and then make that promise that he was going to go do that. So that really impressed me.
So we spent the first half of my slides talking about the problem. Now we're going to talk about some of the answers that Carolyn Brock offers. And Dennis, you're probably going to have to finish these up because I don't think I'm going to get anywhere close to being done with them. But She calls upon us to remember that God resides within each one of us, and the light of God within us claims and names us as sacred offspring of the one eternal light. Do you all ever take the opportunity to think of yourselves as sacred offspring?
No,
I don't always feel like it, but
rarely.
I like it.
I do, but it's hard to get my
Hard to
head around.
sometimes, yeah. Spirit is the resident spark, and so anywhere you see quotation marks, these are quotes from her. Spirit is the resident spark in each of us. It cannot be destroyed. So maybe that goes along a little bit, Ryan, with what you were saying is, is anybody ever totally lost? Is there ever a point at which there's nothing to reclaim? She seems to think that the spark of God can never be totally destroyed in any human being. I like her optimism. The Doctrine and Covenant says, and if you be single to my glory, your whole body shall be filled with light, and there shall be no darkness in you. Give me oil in my lamp, keep me burning, burning, burning.
Yeah.
Give me oil in my lamp. Okay, back to the campfire songs and things. So what images, thoughts, or feelings come to you as you meditate on these possibilities? You ever feel like God's light is resident within you?
I think given me a lot of chances over and over, and as long as I would say as long as it's over, I'm communing and getting to know God.
Amen.
I would say early in my healing process, before I was even divorced, and I went to yoga and at Savasana. One time at the end, and it only happened once, I felt like light could shoot through my fingertips. Yeah, it felt really good.
Like a Marvel movie, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like I could just stand there and light would shoot out.
All right.
Zap the people that had brought them.
Our old friend Joseph Campbell asks, are you the light bulb or the candle, or are you the light? Is there a difference? Are we the vehicle of consciousness, or are we becoming consciousness itself? Are we a thing, or are we the spirit of that thing?
It has to be the spirit.
He also says, or Brock says, cultural messages would have us to believe that we are the body, the vehicle, the bulb, but we are valuable because of what we own, what we do, what we know, or how we look. Those are things that society would say would give us worth. But is that how God looks at us? Those things make us acceptable or not acceptable. And this way of thinking, she says, keeps some on the outside and perpetually vulnerable. Thoughts? Okay, well, I'm going to go on if nobody has anything to say. I know you're thinking about it. Oh, and she says this is an ego-based system. This is about me rather than about us or about God.
Everything Jesus said was against this concept. He befriended the people that even his own disciples thought he shouldn't befriend.
Even the ones that the church of his time,
Yeah.
that the religion of his time said were unclean.
He shocked everybody.
He shocked everybody in
chose
that.
to
Yeah.
do it.
So it's the power. It's not necessary. I guess that's where I'm struggling. It's not the culture, it's power proving. I think there are some really strong, good cultural things. I'm sure you have some in your Native American that I wish we had stronger of in Western culture. But it's the power.
Yeah, that's not, and I don't think that's to
So
say that
I had
all,
to get my brain out of
that
I'm
all
trying to
cultural
divide those.
messages are
Yeah.
wrong, but just that this is a cultural message.
Yeah. And it definitely does try to, keep you down so others can have the power. Again, it's that selfishness.
Well, I think this is what American advertisers try to tell us,
Mhm.
that you are what you own or what
Yeah.
you know.
You're not good enough, but if you use this product, you'll be
be
good enough.
Right.
All right, so being on the outside is meant to bring shame with the premise that one is fundamentally bad, inadequate, defective, unworthy, or not fully valid as a human being. And sadly, this is a message that religion has given us for hundreds, thousands of years that we have to get over. How many of you remember as a child your mom or your dad shaking their finger, or your grandmother? Shame on you.
Yeah, yeah,
Shame on you
oh, yeah.
for doing what you're doing, or whatever you got.
Well,
caught doing.
and if you're Catholic, the original sin,
Yeah, yeah,
you're evil.
exactly. So she says shame can lead to rage, depression, obsessive perfectionism, or destructive life patterns. We talked about mental well-being and how shame
All of it.
can relate to this. And she says, and I thought this was powerful, in subtle ways, shame is the catalyst for all wars, all oppression, all attempts to garner power and control others. And when shame is deeply rooted and has taken over the ego completely, there's a compulsive need to project that shame onto others. When we feel ashamed, we want everybody else to share in that with us and experience our misery.
I don't know. I need to chew on this because I think there is a place for shame. And I think that in our culture, we've lost too much shame. People do a lot of shameless acts, and that if you call them out on it, say, what you're doing is not right, they're saying, who are you to judge me? I can do whatever I want.
Well, later in the chapter, she does talk about, she calls unhealthy shame. And so I don't think they're saying that this is the shame. The shame she's talking about now is the shame that keeps us from experiencing God's grace and
Mhm.
leaves us in the rage, depression, obsessive perfectionism. That's my mother, and she passed it on to me. And it is really, it's destructive. And so what she's talking about here is unhealthy shame, not the shame that,
Not disciplinary.
I think there's a
discipline.
difference between being remorseful for a bad act that you've done. I would agree. I think we all need to have that. And shame that somebody else has put upon you because they have deemed you not good enough by their standards.
I have never.
And I had to wrestle with that a little bit too. I mean, you said you need to think about this a while, and I invite you to do that because I think she's talking about shame in two contexts.
Okay.
Because in my life, until recently, I have never felt worthy. I was that second bullet point, all of it.
I've worked for a number of years with people in my profession who become addicted to substances because we have such potent medications that people think, well, I want to try that out, and then they can't stop trying that out, and they become addicted and have to go to rehab and go into recovery and hopefully get back into their career. And one of the things that we've learned about the treatment of those individuals is, yes, they may have made a bad choice in the beginning to start that, but after a while, your choices are taken away from you when you're addicted, and you can't recover from that anymore. And that's the disease model of addiction. Okay. And yet we continue to project shame on them. Shame on you for being a drug addict. Shame on you for being an alcoholic. They can't help it at that point. Okay. That's not for us to project shame on them. They could say, yes, I take responsibility that I ever started down this road, but it's out of my control now.
Yeah. I agree with that. And maybe the word I was looking for is remorse.
Yeah.
I think our society has gotten rid of guilt and remorse.
And I think it's good to have this remorse as long as it doesn't disable you. If you have remorse to the point of disability, you're probably beating yourself up a little bit too much.
Well, you've got parents who tell their child from an early age, you should never have been born. Or, you're such a horrible, horrible child that, that's really hard for somebody to get.
Well, she talks about the messages that some of the prison people that they worked with received in their childhood about how they ought to be ashamed. Okay. We're out of time, so I'm going to have to quit here, but I got to show you one more slide just because. Just because.
Is that you?
It's me.
That mother you were just talking about.
So anyway, we'll
She's-
pick up next week. Dennis, I'll send you the rest of my slides and you're welcome to use them as you see fit.
He's the one that believes
Okay.
in hear the rod, spoil the child.
Sounds good.
Discussion this morning. I enjoyed your